Slave labor was a huge aspect of Roman life, and the Republic depended heavily on free work from human beings who had no rights, no possessions, and were left at the whims of their masters to be worked to death, starved, tortured, and sometimes even killed for the sake of enjoyment. Sure, you may have seen Russell Crowe play one in a movie, but chances are you have no idea just how brutal it really was. Today works
Rome.
Slaves in ancient Rome didn't just work as domestic or agricultural workers. They did pretty much every single kind of menial job you can imagine. Generally classified as urban or rural, slaves did everything from cooking and cleaning to mining for silver. On country estates, slaves might perform both domestic and non-domestic tasks, even working as smiths, bakers, and guards. Occasionally, urban slaves would work as accountants and managers for businessmen. If you were a slave that originated as a prisoner of war, you might have been sold off to the public and could have been tasked with fighting fires, tending to public buildings, and even working as an executioner. Some Roman slaves lived their entire lives from birth to death working as the property of a master, but others, who were able to cough up a little dough, had a luckier fate. The oldest and easiest way for a slave to achieve freedom was simply being given freedom by one's master, perhaps in a will, although some sort of ceremony or payment usually went along with it. Some folks became slaves by selling themselves into servitude to repay their debts over a certain amount of time. If that was the case, you'd be freed as soon as your contract was complete. Slaves could also accumulate money by giving up peculium, or account, that they controlled while under the authority of a master. This type of wealth could be land or currency, and although it was technically still under the control of the master, slaves could use this as a tool to purchase their freedom. After buying their freedom, slaves didn't just magically become full-fledged Roman citizens, though. After the process of manumission, aka buying their freedom, these former slaves were more like conditional citizens and became clients of their former owners. They were also restricted from taking public office. And if you were under the age of 30 and wanted to buy your way out of servitude, you were completely out of luck. According to the Roman jurist Gaius, slaves under the age of 30 could not be freed during the 1st century CE. Being a slave was cruel and unbearable during any time period, and the Roman slaves were no exception. Slaves who were considered property of the masters were expected to behave, and if they didn't, the consequences were nightmare fuel. In Maniacomi by Plautus, the 2nd century playwright attributes the following words to Messinio, a slave. Stripes, fetters, the mill, weariness, hunger, bitter cold, fine pay for idleness. That's what I'm mightily afraid of. Surely, then, it's much better to be good than to be bad. I don't mind tongue lashings, but I do hate real floggings. Yikes. Slave owners could beat and punish slaves harshly, inflicting everything from whippings to chains and fetters. Masters also had free rein to sell their slaves, execute them by hanging or crucifixion, and make them do the worst possible tasks as punishment. And if you tried to run away, they'd brand you. Ouch! Nothing sounds less appetizing than limited rations of bread, right? Well, slaves, being the lowest rung of Roman society, were clearly not eating like kings. This guy, Cato the Elder, who was a soldier, statesman, and historian from the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, wrote about the daily needs of agricultural slaves, specifically what they should receive for food and drink. According to Cato, slaves should receive wheat to make bread, although shackled slaves who couldn't grind their own grain were to receive bread itself. When slaves worked the fields during the summer, more flour was needed, as was additional wine. If we were working in the hot Roman fields all summer for no money, we'd be in need of additional wine too. In addition to bread and wine, slaves ate what Cato termed relish. This Roman relish, however, was not exactly what you'd find on a baseball stadium hot dog. Instead of pickles, it was made of olives. During the 1st century BCE, slaves rounded out their diets by gathering wild fruits and vegetables, as well as cultivating crops on their own. Domestic slaves got the opportunity to start urban gardens. Of course, they always had the option of picking at their master's leftovers. While most slaves functioned as a coerced unpaid labor pool, some enslaved men and women got to join the ranks of criminals and prisoners of war in the gladiator ring. Made up mostly from slaves, the first gladiatorial contests appeared as early as the 3rd century BCE. One famous slave, Spartacus, was actually trained in one of Rome's gladiator schools. And if the idea of a gladiator school sounds cool to you, let's just say these gladiator training academies weren't exactly sleepaway camps. Gladiators in training were treated more or less like prisoners, but did receive food, medical attention, and specialized apparatus training. Treated more like investments than human beings, these performers weren't slain very often. They were too valuable, according to archaeologist Wolfgang Neubauer. Many former slaves also volunteered to be gladiators. With limited opportunities after buying their freedom, aka manumission, they essentially gave themselves back to servitude, swearing a gladiatorial oath to be burned by fire, bound by chains, to be beaten, to die by the sword. Okay, for an oath, we've got to admit, the gladiator oath is pretty hardcore. But you gotta imagine conditions for freed slaves had to be pretty terrible if they were earnestly volunteering to fight to the death. One thing that urban and rural slaves had in common was that they both lived in rooms that were typically far removed from their masters and overseers. Domestic servants still lived in their master's house, sometimes even sleeping close enough to tend to his or her needs overnight, but there was a decided effort to keep slaves separate from free men and women. Typically, a slave's quarters would be located near storage facilities and were usually shared with other slaves. Imagine a bunk bed next to a garage, but Roman. if you garments worn by poor freemen and women. Masters provided a tunic of 3 feet and a half and a cloak once in 2 years. If you had a long torso, seems like you'd be out of luck. Also, once in 2 years, good shoes should be given. Imagine only getting 1 pair of shoes every 2 years. And this is during a time when duct tape didn't exist. To add insult to injury, male slaves weren't allowed to wear the one quintessential Roman fashion garment, togas. Female slaves were also forbidden from wearing stolas, a dress worn over their tunic. According to Seneca, the Roman Senate once considered instituting a uniform for slaves to more clearly distinguish them in society. They ultimately decided against it to prevent slaves from knowing just how many of their ranks existed. Bone-chilling. Why would the Roman Senate be concerned that the slaves knew how many of them there were? Famous large-scale slave rebellion that truly posed a risk to Roman society. Remember Spartacus, who we talked about earlier? The slave who was sent to train at gladiator school? Well, that same guy grew up to lead a slave revolt that included around 70,000 slaves and supporters fighting the Roman army. Now those are some serious numbers. Spartacus and his forces fought against the Roman military several times from 73 to 71 BCE, defeating them 3 times before being slain. According to sources, Spartacus fought valiantly to the end, wounded by a spear thrust in the thigh but went down on one knee, held a shield in front of him, and fought off his attackers until he and a great number of his followers were encircled and fell. While Spartacus and his army may have lost in the end, their fight didn't amount to nothing.
Slaves varied at any given time. After the Punic Wars during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, thousands of men and women were enslaved, many of whom served as artisans, craftsmen, and agricultural laborers. As the empire expanded, Rome took more and more prisoners of war, and tons of non-Romans were enslaved, including individuals from Greece, Egypt, North Africa, Gaul, and Asia Minor, and fundamental to the Roman economy. But there were different opinions on how slaves should be viewed in Roman society. Stoics, most notably Seneca the Younger, wrote about the relationship between slave and master, emphasizing the humanity of the former alongside the responsibility of the latter to be kind and paternalistic. According to Seneca, a slave sprang from the same stock, is smiled upon by the same skies, and on equal terms with yourself breathes, lives, and dies. Former slave Epictetus lived and taught in Rome, also calling for the fair treatment of slaves by masters. Epictetus found slaves to be noble, but is nobility the same as freedom? Not exactly. One thing's for certain, any society that depends on slave labor is not a sustainable and just culture. Good thing slavery fell along with the Roman Empire in 476 CE.
Of the Roman military into what was essentially the first Roman imperial army. Welcome to our video on the Marian Reforms of the late Republic. In 113 BC, a roaming army of Germanic warriors crossed Rome's border on the Danube, driven by unlivable climate conditions in their homeland. For the next few years, they rampaged around Roman territory and defeated a few Roman armies. In 105 BC, they crushed an army of 80,000 legionaries at Arausio, after which the situation became critical. The Roman people were terrified and expected the Germanic hordes at the gates of Rome at any time. It seemed as though the Republic might fall until one man returned to take command, Gaius Marius. He had just finished the Jugurthine War against the Numidians and was elected consul in absentia during the year 105 BC. Upon his return to Rome, he began to drastically alter the military in order to combat this new threat. His reforms would have a wide-ranging impact, both on the legions and the state of Rome. It is worth noting that not all of his changes were novel. Generals before Marius had paved the way for them, and had partaken in various different tactics before this time, such as the reduction of the baggage train. Marius, however, both created new methods for the Roman army, and permanently instituted the effective methods of the other commanders who had come before him. Until Marius's reforms, there was a property requirement to join the citizen militia legions. This limited the number of legionaries, as they had to supply their own arms and armor, and had to own property valued at 3,500 sesterces or more. Perhaps the most important reform implemented by Marius was to ignore this property requirement. He allowed the Capitae Censi of Rome to join the legions, those counted by the head. The landless poor were now among the ranks of those who could join the legions, even though they had no property. On top of, and because of this, Marius arranged for the state to supply the legions with their arms and armor, offered poor recruits the chance to gain a professional soldier's pay, and the chance to gain loot and plunder on campaign. The masses, with little hope of gaining status in any other occupation, flocked to Marius's new legions. In contrast to the earlier Roman policy in which the citizen army would disband after a campaign, recruits were now enlisted for a term of 16 years. This created a standing Roman army for the first time, and drastically increased its quality. On the other hand, the balanced cross-sectional army of the Roman people at war was destroyed, in favour of an army made up mainly of the landless poor, the proletarii. This would eventually have grave consequences for the Republic, as the poor soldiers became loyal to their generals rather than to the Roman state. While this seems like a landmark change, it is also possible that these reforms were just the final stage in an already occurring gradual decline in property requirements for the Roman army. The organisation of the various Roman units was also completely changed in these reforms. The early maniple system was last recorded being used in the Battle of Muthul in the Jugurthine War of 109 BC. As the system had become obsolete and needed replacement, the Romans did away with it without sentimentality. By 104 BC, Marius had discarded 4 of the 5 legionary standards which had been used for command and control purposes: the Minotaur, Horse, Boar, and Wolf. Only one remained, the Aquila, or Eagle. This is when the Roman Eagle standard became the emblem of the Roman legions. To replace the maniples as the primary tactical unit of the Roman military, the cohort was adopted. Compared to the 120-strong maniple, a standard republican cohort was a larger 600-strong unit, comprised of 6 centuries. 480 of these men were legionaries, whereas the other 120 were non-combatants, either servants, slaves, or tactical support personnel such as engineers. The component unit, the Roman century, was a 100-strong unit commanded by a centurion. In this unit, 80 men served as legionaries and 20 men were non-combatants. There was also no designated military commander of a cohort itself, and it is widely believed that either the most senior centurion took command, or the 6 centurions commanded together as a council. The smallest and most personal unit in this system was the contubernium. This was comprised of 10 men commanded by an officer called a decanus. 8 men were legionaries and only 2 were non-combatants. 10 contubernia made up a century, and 6 centuries made up a cohort. It was 10 of these new military divisions which made up a new Roman legion of around 6,000 men, with 4,800 legionaries and 1,200 non-combatants. The abolition of the manipular system also abolished the 3 distinct lines of infantry of the mid-republic. The hastati, principes, and triarii were removed, and instead 3 lines of infantry equipped similarly to the earlier principes were adopted. The form of triplex acies used in the Marian legion was different to the one implemented prior to it. Cohorts were a solid unit with only small gaps in between them, compared to the previous maniple system with larger gaps. This, along with the increased depth of the new cohorts, reduced the tendency of the soldiers to panic and flee, as they would feel they had more support and were safe. The legions were now on their way to becoming the force of popular imagination, a homogeneous force of heavy infantry armed with the gladius as their primary weapon, and a dagger called the pugio as a sidearm. These new uniform warriors were all named legionarii. Their equipment mostly remained the same, but some tweaks were made. The iron shank of the pilum javelin was previously attached to the wooden shaft by 2 nails. However, Marius replaced one of the nails with a less sturdy wooden peg. On impact, the peg would snap, rendering the pilum useless and bending the shank at a right angle, making the enemy even more encumbered by the impaling of their shields. As for protection, the legionarii wore a helmet, body armor, and greaves. Their main protection, however, was still the large scutum shield, which covered the soldier from shoulder to shin. A legionary would also bash and batter opponents with this shield, despite its weight. In this way, it could be just as offensive as his blade. The 1,200 non-combat attendants may seem like a lot of support personnel at first glance, but it is important to remember the key role of logistics in warfare. Without food, animals, fuel, and maintenance, an army could not function. The reforms did not ignore logistics, and the creation of Marius's mules was a perfect example of this. Under Marius, legionaries began to carry all of their equipment themselves, rather than relying on a cumbersome baggage train. This had many positive impacts for the operations of the army. The soldiers themselves became conditioned by their heavy load, with the physical training increasing their endurance during combat. In addition, the soldiers carrying their own entrenching equipment allowed for the rapid construction of fortifications, camps, and earthworks. Finally, the lack of a massive baggage train also allowed the legions to move extremely quickly compared to their prior speed. The only drawbacks were the complaints from the legionaries about their new heavy workload, becoming referred to as Marius's mules, named so for their heavy packs. As the Republic progressed, the unpopular nature of horsemanship in Roman society resulted in a severe deficit of cavalry. While the Romans were still fighting smaller foes on their peninsula, the smaller cavalry wing they possessed was adequate. However, as they began to come into contact with larger external foes with fearsome cavalry contingents such as the Germans or Gauls, it resulted in serious setbacks, despite their lethal heavy infantry. After the Battle of Zama, Roman armies were almost always accompanied by a significant force of non-Italian cavalry. This became even more pronounced in the time of Marius, as he disbanded most of the Roman and Italian cavalry, replacing it entirely with native allied cavalry, who were often better trained and had specialized equipment from their homeland. In his later conquest of Gaul, Julius Caesar relied heavily on the famous Numidian cavalry, and later his Gallic and Germanic heavy cavalry for his victories in that war. Indeed, the final cavalry charge that gained victory at the Battle of Alesia in 52 BC was made by Caesar's German cavalry. Allied light infantry auxilia were also used in place of the earlier velites, which Marius disbanded. Various native peoples from around and outside the empire were used, including but not limited to German light infantry, Balearic slingers, Cretan archers, and light Spanish melee troops. Using his newly honed legions and tactics, Marius was successful, and the Cimbri were defeated once and for all at the battles of Aquae Sextiae and Vercellae in 102 and 101 BC. The reforms had their desired effect on the army, making it a standing professional force which did not disband after campaigning, allowing it to retain its experience. In the coming centuries, this would set the stage for the development of the most efficient and deadly army of the ancient world. Despite the benefits, such massive changes would not go without consequence for the Republic. Because the general of a Roman army was responsible for the payment of their soldiers in both land and coin, the armies would often be more loyal to their general than to the Roman state. This was exacerbated as the majority of legionaries were now the poorer proletarii who desired payment and advancement. As a result, power began to shift from the senatorial class to the commanders in the field. From Marius to Sulla, Pompey, and finally to Caesar, this would cause a series of power struggles between various strongmen of Rome, which led to a series of civil wars. Eventually, the strain of these immense social changes would result in the rise of the imperial